All right. Hello. This is our fourth lecture now, fourth video lecture. This is when we're actually going to start getting into sort of the nitty gritty of moral philosophy. This is going to be a pretty technical lecture. Just going to warn you guys about that. I think it'll be clear as we sort of move through the theories, everything I sort of say here, as we move through sort of the next few class periods, it'll be more clear. So don't get too upset if you don't sort of get it all just from this. I just sort of ran out of time. It would be kind of cruel to make you guys watch an hour and a half video. I'd rather just split it up into different lectures. That being said, though, this stuff is very important. A lot of exam questions sort of do come from questions about, is this theory duty-based or value-based? What is this theory's theory of intrinsic value? Those are the sorts of questions I ask. So be sure to sort of be on the lookout and make sure you understand the stuff. Rewatch the lecture if you need to, or just parts of it. It shouldn't be too bad, but also you are going to be required to sort of think about this stuff and understand this stuff. It is kind of technical, and it's a little weird to sort of to just kind of have this big knowledge dump. That's kind of what it is. It's just like a lot of stuff and terms, and I think it's clear. I like this sort of selection. I like Timmons because he's able to break it down to be really clear, but also philosophy is kind of weird. It's not like other disciplines. So if this is your first philosophy class, this is where it gets a little weird and sort of hard to maybe understand just by being exposed to it. So with that being said, we're going to go ahead and keep moving. So let's do it. So last lecture, I ended by discussing how moral theories help us analyze different moral situations. That's what we're going to be doing in this class. So starting probably in about 2 weeks, a week and a half, 2 weeks, we'll be starting on abortion. Then we'll move through euthanasia and gun rights and sort of a lot of moral dilemmas. Okay, that's what this class is about. And what moral theories do is they help us analyze these sorts of things so we can come to justified or correct conclusions about them. Okay. Moral theories often do this by claiming or arguing that something is intrinsically good and then deriving a theory of right from that, or by claiming some moral duty is like a fundamental duty and deriving a theory of right from that. Hopefully by the end of this video, you'll sort of have a better grasp of what exactly I mean by that. But I'm just going to go ahead and allude to it, just to like maybe get it in your brain a little bit. Like I just said, this is kind of a dense lecture. So rewatch parts of it as you need to. Luckily, it's on YouTube, so watch as many times as you want. And again, I'm just going to warn you, if you don't get this stuff, you're not going to do very well in this class. This is going to be very important. I think this is very important stuff, and it's my class, so you're going to have to learn it. Okay, so what is a moral theory? So in moral philosophy, right and wrong are different than good and bad. Okay, so I'm going to just talk about sort of what right and wrong mean for the next slide or two. So right and wrong are used to evaluate actions. Okay, all moral theories attempt to address the nature of right and wrong. That's just part of what the point of doing moral philosophy is. We want to come to conclusions about what a right or wrong action would be. Okay, but from this, there's sort of two ways to understand what a right action is. Okay, and as we move through moral theories, I'll sort of highlight sort of these different notions of what right action is, because sometimes some moral theories will say, well, this is an obligatory action, or this is a permissible action, and those are just different things. Okay, so there's two senses of right. There's right sort of as in like all right, like it's all right to do this. This is what's referred to as the broad sense of right. And it's like, it's all right to do this action. Usually it means it's all right to not do the action either. So think about donating to charity. Most people think it's all right to donate to charity, but you're not necessarily doing anything wrong if you, on like a specific instance, don't donate to charity. Okay, let's say you only have $5 and you need to buy lunch. I'm not saying like you'd be right to like never donate to charity, but just in like one specific instance, just because you don't donate to charity doesn't mean you did a wrong thing. Okay, so that's sort of the first sense of what right means. It's like all right. Second, there's right as like obligatory. Okay, this is what's called the narrow sense of right. And if you're using right in this sense, it means you would be wrong to not perform that action. Okay, so think about popular example comes from Peter Singer. I think we'll actually read this article later this semester. But think about you're walking in a park and you see a drowning 6-year-old that's in a lake. You're the only one that can save him. The right action to do, most people think, would be to run in or swim in and save the drowning kid. In fact, you would be wrong to not do that. If you just sat there and watched a kid drown, you would be doing the wrong thing. Okay, so it's like obligatory to save the child. That's just a kind of a clear example, hopefully. But these are two different senses of what right is. Okay, so from this we can derive or sort of form 3 basic categories of moral evaluation that any given action may or may not fall into. Okay, so coming from that second notion of right, there's what's called obligatory actions. These are actions that one morally ought to do and that would be wrong to fail to do so. So this is right in that narrow sense. And like I said, the previous slide, all this means is it would be wrong to not perform these actions. Okay, it would be wrong to not save somebody if you could save them from drowning, something like that. To just passively stand there and watch somebody drown, that would be the wrong thing to do. Okay. Second, there's what's called optional actions, and these are actions that are not obligatory and not wrong. Okay, so this is sort of that first sort of notion of what right means, like all right to either do or not. You'll hear me sort of refer to these as like permissible actions, but permissible and optional are synonymous, sort of in moral philosophy. You're permitted to do this. It doesn't mean you have to. It just means you are permitted to do it. Okay. So think about donating to charity, or think about giving some money to like a homeless person. You're not necessarily wrong for not doing it, but you are permitted to do either one. Okay. Third, there's what's called wrong actions, and these are just actions that one ought not to do. So think about randomly assaulting some stranger on the side of the road. That is a wrong action. You ought not do that ever. Okay, so all actions are going to fall into like one of these 3 categories. And different moral theories will have different, they'll sort of determine the same action sometimes to be in different ones. So like, let's say we're reasoning using sort of like utilitarian calculus, it would be like, an action would be right. But if you sort of use Kantianism, that action would be deemed wrong. Okay, it just depends sort of on the moral theory that you use. Okay, more on that later. All right, so now we're going to talk about what good and bad are. Like I said earlier, good and bad are different than right and wrong. Okay, moral philosophy, good and bad are used primarily to assess the value of things. So this is sort of all things. So think about people, like their character. Somebody's character could be good or bad. If somebody goes around and kicks puppies, they probably have a bad character. Experiences, so like let's say you go to Taco Bell and you have a bad experience, as people do sometimes. That experiences can be bad. States of affairs, that's just a fancy sort of word, like a philosophy word for like things as they are. So like I'm sitting at my desk right now, drinking coffee, doing a video lecture. Okay, that's like a state of affair. Okay, it can be good or bad. So there are 2 ways in which something can be valuable. And this sort of like value includes something can have good value, like, or bad value, sort of positive or negative value. Okay. And there's 2 ways in which something can be valuable. There's what's called intrinsic value. And this is when something is valuable because of the features that are inherent to it. So think about this as like something is good in itself. Like a lot of people think happiness when they when they sort of think about, something that's intrinsically good, it's only good in itself. It's not really good for anything else. So like a lot of people think about happiness. If we were in person, I'd go around the room and sort of say, well, what do you guys think is good in itself? Happiness comes up a lot because we do a lot of things to be happy, but we aren't happy for a lot of reasons. It'd be kind of weird to say, oh, well, I'm happy today, so I can, go to work. It's like, no, I go to work so I can make money, so I can be happy, so I can be comfortable, which helps me be happy. Okay. There are other things people consider to be of intrinsic value. I'll probably list some more things. What you'll find is a lot of moral theories, they sort of turn on this idea of different things being intrinsically valuable. Okay. And there's sort of arguments to support one thing being having intrinsic value or not. You'll see that sort of as we go through different theories. Secondly, there's what's called extrinsic value, and this is when something is valuable because it relates to something else that is valuable, whether that something else is intrinsically valuable or also just extrinsically valuable. Okay, and this is what happens when something is valuable or good for something. Okay, so think about money. Money is a really good example of this. You don't like money because money itself is cool. Having, fat stacks of, $100 bills under your mattress is good for some things. Like you can go buy whatever you want. You can go out to eat, drink, whatever, using that money. But in itself, having that money, you wouldn't just hoard money if it didn't do anything. So think about, I don't know if you've seen like post-apocalyptic shows like The Walking Dead or something, but like there's some scenes in like horror movies or stuff, or like post-apocalyptic movies where you just see like a bunch of money blowing in the wind. It's because it's useless. It's no longer valuable because it's not good for anything, except maybe burning for warmth or something like that. Okay, but even then it would just have extrinsic value, which is to keep you warm, which is to help you survive. Okay, so extrinsic value, like things that are extrinsically valuable can be good for other things that are extrinsically valuable. So like, let's say just for the sake of an example, let's say we think happiness isn't intrinsically valuable. Let's say snowboarding makes me happy. Money's also going to be extrinsically valuable because with money I can go snowboarding, which is extrinsically valuable because it makes me happy. Okay, I would like draw that on the board and put arrows because it's like sort of from money you get snowboarding, from snowboarding you get happy. That's sort of the way it works. So things that are extrinsically valuable can be valuable because it gets you things that are intrinsically valuable, or things that are extrinsically valuable, which you sort of run a chain, and then you end up, finally with something that's intrinsically valuable. Okay, hope that made sense. So all philosophical accounts of value focus on intrinsic value. There's no theory of extrinsic value because everybody just sort of accepts that extrinsically valuable things, end up getting you intrinsically valuable things. That's sort of how it works. Where a lot of the arguing happens is sort of what you take as being intrinsically valuable. And all the moral theories we're going to talk about, if they're value-based, which I'll get to a little later, they're going to take different things as being intrinsically valuable. Okay. But before we get there, there are three ways in which something can have intrinsic value. So it can be intrinsically good, and this just means a thing is good in itself. So I talked about happiness last slide. Virtue, a lot of people think virtue is like intrinsically good. Wisdom, or maybe art. There's a typo there. But just think about anything that you think is good in itself, something that's not good for anything else. It's just like that thing that is based on its own sort of nature or properties is good. Okay. So like knowledge, I thought about putting knowledge. Knowledge is kind of weird because some people are like, well, I'm only learning stuff to, get a job or something like that. But wisdom's a little different than knowledge. So these are just sort of examples of what some people take to be things of intrinsic goodness. Okay. Second, we have intrinsically bad, and this is just when a thing is bad in itself. So sort of the opposite of happiness would be just extreme and pointless pain. So think about like somebody with cancer, like throat cancer. who is, let's say, stage 4 is already going to die. They're in extreme pain. That pain is no longer sort of serving its evolutionary purpose because, they're already going to die. That would be intrinsically bad because that pain is not good for anything. It's just horrible. And it just sort of, right before, not only is this thing going to kill you, it's going to put you in an immense amount of pain. Someone being like really vicious. So think about somebody that runs around telling lies because they think it's funny, or somebody that, punts puppies at the park, something like that. Cruelty, being just mean and cruel and inflicting pain on innocent people. Possessing these sorts of things would be like intrinsically bad. Okay. These are just examples, like I said, and this is all an open question. Like different moral theories will take different things to be intrinsically good and intrinsically bad. Okay. Thirdly, we have what's called intrinsically value neutral. And this is a thing that's not intrinsically good or bad. Okay. These things are only going to be good in terms of their extrinsic worth. So think about, literally anything else. I thought about having like a longer list, but literally anything that is not intrinsically good or bad will fall into this third category. So think about ice cream, think about like TikTok, cars, money, iPhones, Snapchat, all those things. They're just value neutral, okay? Because they're not good or bad in themselves, okay? Even though I guess you could argue that TikTok is intrinsically bad, but that'd be an interesting argument. Okay, so from all this, we can finally sort of define what a moral theory is. So a moral theory, this is sort of the running definition. It's just a theory about the nature of the right and the good and about the proper method for making correct or justified decisions, okay? Where these decisions are like of a moral concern, okay? So all 7 moral theories we will cover are going to do this. And I just want to note here, just in terms of like the rest of the semester, think about these moral theories as like tools or formulas for evaluating moral dilemmas or situations. You can think of them like a tool belt, or like Batman's, I guess he has a tool belt, there's sort of, I like the math example a little bit more. It's like, imagine having a really hard math problem, but if you know like a certain set of mathematical formulas, they'll help you solve it. That's sort of the best metaphor for what moral theories are, at least for the sake of this class. They're sort of like, they provide you like a method for reasoning morally. They like structure your moral reasoning in a certain way that allows you to come to, if not correct, at least justified conclusions about things of like a moral concern. Okay. Namely, if any given action is right or wrong. Okay. That's what they all do. And that's sort of the way I'd like you guys to think about it for this class. That's sort of, that's the way I think about it. So hopefully that helps a little bit. All right, so here are some of like the main questions that a moral theory attempts to answer. So like what makes an action right or wrong? And this basically just means what explains why right actions are right or wrong actions are wrong, okay? What makes something good or bad? And this is just what best explains why intrinsically good things are intrinsically good, okay? Because like all moral theories are going to take, all moral theories that are like value-based are going to take something to be intrinsically good, okay? It's not a theory of extrinsic good. I just want to be clear on that. It's only things that are intrinsically good. Third, what is the proper method for reasoning our way to correct or justified moral conclusions about the rightness or wrongness of actions and about the goodness or badness of things subject to moral evaluation, okay? These are going to be just what all moral theories do, okay? And it's going to come to what's called 2 aims. There's 2 aims to every moral theory, okay? So to better understand more fully what a moral theory is and how it attempts to answer these questions, we're going to look at sort of the 2 aims of what a moral theory does. There's 2 goals. Think of these as like the 2 goals of any decent moral theory. First is going to be the theoretical aim, and this is to discover those underlying features of actions, persons, or other items of moral evaluation that make them right or good, and explain why those things have the properties they do. So this sort of corresponds to our first 2 questions going back here. What makes something right or wrong, and what makes something good or bad? I had that sort of subset, but I can just jump back to the slide. And basically, these are going to sort of serve as what's called the moral criteria for the right or the good. Okay, this is like the criteria. This is the standard by which we're going to evaluate things as being right or wrong or good or bad. Okay, just keep in mind, right and good do not mean the same thing in moral philosophy. They're different. All right. Second, we have what's called the practical aim. This is sort of more of what this class is about. So last lecture I mentioned sort of applied ethics. This is what sort of applied ethics it's about. It's about practical guidance for how we might arrive at correct or justified moral verdicts on matters that are a moral concern. Okay, it's how you apply sort of the theoretical part of moral philosophy to like any given situation or dilemma or matter or whatever. Okay, and this corresponds to the third question: what's the proper method for reasoning morally in any given situation? So given these two aims, we can actually evaluate moral theories by seeing how well it satisfies them. In my opinion, some moral theories do a better job at one of these two things than others. So most currently, like most contemporary moral philosophers are like consequentialists, they're Kantians, or they do sort of like prima facie duties. That's sort of the big three. I'll just go ahead and say that. Those are the ones that are sort of taken the most seriously right now because people just have the least amount of problems with those. They think they sort of, to put it plainly, most people sort of think those sets of theories sort of accomplish these two aims the best. All moral theories try to, some do it better than others. Some people, I'm not going to say it's subjective, but some people do think, there are virtue ethicists around, for instance. So people do think that some moral theories can do a better job than what other people think they can do. However, I'll flag that stuff later as we go through each moral theory. But before that, let's just gain a clear understanding of these aims by considering the role that principles play in moral theories. So this is going to be a huge part of this class, at least for these first few lectures, because everything's going to be sort of put in this principle form. So we'll get to that here in a minute. What actually is like the form of a moral principle. But in attempting to satisfy like the theoretical and practical aims of moral philosophies, philosophers propose what's called moral principles. And these are just very general moral statements that specify conditions under which an action is right or wrong, or something is good or bad. Often moral principles will do the same thing at the same time, or do both things at the same time. So they'll sort of build in, it's like from any given moral theory, you can usually sort of suppose what is of intrinsic value if it's not just explicitly spelled out, in some other way. From that, there's two kinds of moral principles. So hopefully you sort of noticed like an action is right or wrong, or something is good or bad. So from that, it's like there's principles of right conduct that just state conditions under which an action is right. That's sort of the first part of that definition. And then there's principles of value. And these just specify conditions under which something has intrinsic value, or whether it does at all. Okay, moving on. So here's just an example of a moral principle. And they're going to have sort of the following formulation. I wish I could circle this, but you see how there's like a P sort of to the left, and then there's sort of this like definition. That's the way that moral principles are going to be formulated, at least in this class. This is how they often are in papers and stuff. But what happens is you sort of have a letter that represents the principle. This is just P because it's an example. And then you'll sort of have a definition that states some conditions under which something's good or bad, or right or wrong, or both. Okay, so keep in mind this is just an example, but let's just take the following moral principle P. An action is right if and only if it would likely bring about at least as much happiness as any available alternative action. Okay, notice how I have IFF dot next to if and only if. That's a shorthand for if and only if. So I'm not going to write out if and only if. I'm just going to do it shorthand for the rest of this class, but now you know what it means. So this principle attempts to tell us what makes an action right. Okay. In this case, facts about how much overall happiness an action will bring about is what makes an action right. Okay. So let's say you have two potential actions. Let's say you have, let's say you went to Baskin Robbins and you get a free ice cream cone, other than the one that you bought an ice cream cone, and they're like, "Hey, you can have another one." And you see a kid outside crying, and you're like, "Oh, well, I could give him this extra ice cream cone, or I could not." Okay, so let's say action A is you give the ice cream cone to the kid. Action B is you withhold and you keep the ice cream cone yourself, your second ice cream cone. You have good reason, I think, to think that more overall happiness will be brought about by giving the kid an ice cream cone. Kids tend to get very excited about ice cream. So from this moral principle, the right action would be to probably give that kid your extra ice cream cone. Okay. That's very simple, but just sort of roll with it. That's just how these moral principles work. Okay. They sort of state these conditions, and then you can sort of like run through possible actions and see which one, in this case, brings about the most happiness. That's going to be the right action. Okay. Also, from moral principles, you can infer what makes an action wrong. So I have P sort of asterisk. An action is wrong if and only if it would likely not bring about as much overall happiness as would some available alternative action. Okay. Moral theories themselves aren't really spelled out about wrong actions, at least the ones that we cover in the rest of this class are only going to be about right action. But you can infer what a wrong action would be from any of the ones that are about right action. That's just the way sort of moral principles work. So I may have you guys, as we move through, just sort of like, for quizzes and stuff, sort of tell me what a moral principle of wrong action would be from any given theory that we cover. So just know that you can do that, and it's kind of easy. We're not going to be covering it though anymore. Okay. So like I just said, I just sort of said this, most theories just focus on formulas of right action. In fact, all the ones we're going to cover just focus on theories of right action or formulas of right action. But in addition to serving as moral criteria, principles like P are typically intended to provide some practical guidance for coming to correct or justified moral verdicts. So like that was my kid with the ice cream example. You're supposed to, like, in a moral dilemma, use these formulas or use these moral principles to evaluate the moral worth of possible actions. Okay. Where that worth is right or wrong, or permissible. Right isn't obligatory, permissible isn't permissible, and then wrong isn't don't do it. And the idea is just that if P is correct, we should be able to use it to guide our moral deliberation so that we can come to justified conclusions or correct conclusions about the rightness of actions. Like the idea is sort of like in fulfilling the practical aim of moral philosophy is that when you're in sort of a moral dilemma or a moral situation, you can use these theories to reason morally. They help you structure sort of your reasoning so that you can sort of get, come to like some certain conclusion about what the right action is. Okay. It's like the basis for moral decision making. Okay. It's almost mathematical. It's almost mechanical, if you want to think about it like that. Okay, so let's return. So you heard me sort of talk about, the example of the kid in the ice cream cone. But let's return to the trolley problem. I covered this last lecture. I'm just going to briefly explain it again. So you find yourself in sort of an unfortunate situation. There's this trolley speeding down the tracks. It's uncontrolled, and it's either going to hit 5 people, or you can flip a switch and change it, and it'll just hit 1 person and kill 1 person. Okay, so you have 2 options. You can either not flip the switch and watch 5 people die, or you can flip the switch and kill 1 person but save 5 people. Okay, those are your only options. This is a thought experiment. There's no other. I'm going to be clear on this. You can't untie anybody or put something in front of the trolley, stop it. It's just not part of it. You have two possible actions. Okay. So let's return to our principle. Remember, it says an action is right if and only if it would likely bring about as much happiness as any available alternative action. So using P, I'd ask you all to, if we were in person, we would spend 10 minutes or so getting people's opinions on what they think the right action would be in virtue of this principle. But since we're online, I'd like you to, take a minute. You can pause the video. I'll stop talking for a few seconds, and just think about, from this principle, what would the right action be? Okay, not in your opinion, just from this principle. Okay, I'm gonna keep going. But if you do need more time, think about it, that's fine. So odds are you decided that saving 5 people and killing the 1 would be the right action. Remember, it's because we're using P, not our own opinions or reasoning. And this is just because odds are more happiness will result if 5 people are alive and 1 person dies than vice versa, rather than 1 person being alive and 5 people dying. That's just sort of the way happiness works, is there's more happiness if there's more people. That's thinking about this scenario, you don't know these people or anything like that. Odds are that's what the right thing to do is. However, this is open for debate. And the more or less we know about a situation can change what's justified or correct. So for instance, let's say that one person is a sort of cancer researcher, and they can save, if they're alive and can continue their research, they'll end up saving thousands upon thousands of people. And the 5 people are just sort of, let's say they're just petty criminals. Odds are then more happiness will result from saving the 1 person and killing the 5. So I just want to highlight this, sort of like, the more a scenario changes, or the more we're informed of certain things, that can also sort of change what the right action would be, all things considered. I'll highlight when we get to consequentialism sort of some issues with this sort of reasoning, but we'll save that for another lecture. So whatever your opinion was, or whatever your verdict was, I'm not going to say opinion, whatever your sort of judgment was, I would say, like, go ahead and think about how many considerations you have. But I will also say there's no straightforward answers in philosophy. That's just not the way it works. You'll never get like odds are you'll never get, okay, this is obviously the right thing to do. It sort of depends sometimes. Sometimes with simple examples, it's like that. But in the real world, it's very hard to come up with a definite sort of verdict or judgment. Okay, so to sum up sort of the discussion of just like moral theories, what a moral theory does is it puts forth moral principles of right conduct and value, which are supposed to explain what makes an action right or wrong, or a thing good or bad. And then it's supposed to sort of help us reason morally, okay? And this is supposed to satisfy sort of the theoretical and practical aim of moral philosophy. There's a typo there, I'm sorry, because it defines moral criteria and then it posits some method for reasoning morally, okay? That's what moral philosophy is supposed to do. It's supposed to sort of set some theoretical criteria and then give us some practical guidance on how to use that theoretical criteria in the real world. That's the point. Some do it better than others, but we'll get to that in a few lectures. Ooh, excuse me. So now I'm going to talk about, sort of for the rest of this lecture, what's called the structure of a moral theory. This is going to be sort of one of the harder things to grasp, I think, just from this lecture. You may have sort of a superficial understanding, which is entirely fine, but we will be talking about this distinction more throughout the semester and sort of when we actually talk in depth about moral theories, okay? So the structure of a moral theory pertains to how that theory connects the right and the good. And there's two ways in which a moral theory can be structured. It's what's called value-based moral theories and duty-based moral theories. Okay. And like I said, this distinction will be more clear as we move through the theories themselves. But I'm going to ask you guys on exams, on your papers, on quizzes about this. So it's going to be very, very important to understand this distinction because so many students don't, and that's why they don't get, an A in the course. It's going to be important. Okay. So value-based moral theories. These moral theories take the concept of the good to be more basic than the concept of right. So what does this mean? It means that right is derived from whatever is of intrinsic worth, okay? Where intrinsic worth is sort of is picked by each theory, okay? Another way to say that, it defines the rightness of actions in terms of considerations of intrinsic goodness. So going back to P, you can flip back in the video and go back to P. I didn't copy and paste it here. But since P defines right actions in terms of considerations of happiness, which P takes to be of intrinsic worth, P is going to be a value-based moral theory, okay? Because it says, well, happiness is of intrinsic worth, so the right action is going to be the one that gives the most happiness in any given situation. That's going to be the right action. I would sort of draw it on the board, but like sort of imagine one box sort of on the left-hand side of a piece of paper, and you write happiness and then draw an arrow from that box into action or sort of rightness of actions. Okay. So this probably won't mean much right now, but this includes versions of like consequentialism, natural law theory, and virtue ethics. Those are all going to be value-based moral theories because they're all going to take some sort of thing to be intrinsically good, and they're going to derive rightness of actions from that thing. Okay. Like I said, I wish I had a board, but if it's unclear, you can reach out to me and we'll sit around and on Zoom and I'll try to explain it. All right, now we have what's called duty-based moral theories. These theories take the concept of duty to be basic and so define the rightness of actions independently of considerations of goodness. Okay. They don't use anything of intrinsic worth to derive right or wrong action, okay? This will become more clear sort of as we move through the theories. It'll be especially clear with Kantianism, deontology. But I will say this, going back to P, since P defines the rightness in terms of how much happiness will be produced by possible action, P is not going to be duty-based. It's value-based. And a moral theory cannot really be both, unless we're talking about sort of prima facie duties, which is sort of a hybrid theory. Most moral theories are going to be one or the other. And it's sort of unclear with prima facie duties if it's either one or both or a mixture. But we'll get to that. I think that's actually the last moral theory we'll be covering. It's sort of it takes sort of learning some other ones to really understand that one. So like considerations about how much of like whatever is intrinsically good will be brought about are never going to be part of duty-based moral theories. You're never going to be like thinking with a duty-based moral theory, oh, well, there will be more happiness in the world if I do this action, so I should do that action. It's going to be more like, so let's say, here's just a simple example. Let's return to the ice cream store where you just got a second ice cream cone. Let's say, just for the sake of the example, that you have like a duty to, let's say you have a duty of charity. A lot of people think we have duties of charity. And you see, some homeless guy or some indigent individual that obviously doesn't have a lot of money, and you have this extra ice cream cone. So the moral deliberation there would be like, you can either decide to give the ice cream cone or not. And you would sort of think, well, which would fulfill this duty of charity? Giving the ice cream cone would fulfill that duty of charity because you're giving something that, you own to somebody else sort of just out of kindness. So then you would do that. And remember, that's just different because it's the sort of considerations that you're using in your moral deliberation. So instead of thinking, oh, well, how much happiness is going to be brought about? You're like, okay, well, which action sort of corresponds to this duty I have? Okay. Hopefully that was clear. It'll, like I said, this don't worry about as much until we sort of move through moral theories. It'll become more clear as we move through things. Okay. Like deontological theories are like this, like Kantianism is like this, and aspects of like prima facie duties are going to be. I mean, it's in the name, prima facie duties. That's going to be part of it as well. Okay, so that's the end of this lecture. I will say this: the quiz is going to be due on Sunday. That's the 30th. It's going to be due at 5 p.m. It's just going to be like the last ones you guys have done. We'll start with the actual theories next class. Hopefully I'll be able to make it through consequentialism and natural law theory. Consequentialism is the longest one because we go over 2 forms. It'll also sort of help a lot of these what we talked about today become a little bit more clear. As always, please reach out to me if you have any questions or need to meet with me. I'm available. And yeah, have a good weekend. Thank you.